In this video, I'm going to show you how you can build an AI chatbot that allows you to take the link of any YouTube video and analyze the comments by asking questions about them. The goal is to have a practical application of an AI chatbot, in this case, to figure out new content opportunities by seeing what people are saying in the comments. So we can ask a question like, what are the main questions people ask? We take all the comments of the video, add them as context, and get this response. So main thing would be cost about the API. And then we see, those are concerns of people. And then we can use that to make our own videos, or if it's our own video, improve on that. And now let me show you how I can build that step by step. For this application, we're going to be using Gemini's 2.0 Flash. This allows us to put in quite a large context window, meaning the comments that we scrape from the video directly into the prompt without having to build a full-on RAG application like we would do with other things, because the context price is just too high. But with 10 cents per 1 million tokens, we will not run into those issues. To work with Gemini, we first have to go on ai.google.dev. We then click on Explore Models, and we generate an API key by clicking here. We get the API key, we create one, and then we save it in our project under the .env file, so it can be used for the entire project. We now open a new project in VS Code, and then we make a new folder where we then store all our files. We then CT in this folder, and inside this folder we create a new virtual environment. In this virtual environment, we then store all our files and package that we use, so it's contained for this project. We then activate this virtual environment and pip install all our required packages. All the packages that we will need for this project, so Flask, Google Generative AI, and YouTube Comment Downloader. After all this is installed, we then create a new Flask app, which will be the function which runs our web server and function it as the whole app in itself. We then also have to create a .env file, which is a secure file in which we're going to store our API key that we have created beforehand, so we can call that in our entire project. Then inside this .env file, we add Gemini API key, and then you add your API key right here. And then later on in the Flask app, we can call this code. And if you have any other API keys, we can also add this in this file and then reference this part later on in the app. Inside our Flask app, in here, the first thing we will do is get our important imports, which will be Flask, which we need to run our web server. Then Google Generative AI, which is the wrapper of Gemini, which we can then instantly call and configure without having to actually HTTP call the API every single time, which makes our life way easier. Then we have the .env file, where we can then load the data from the API key that we stored in there, and the YouTube Comment Downloader, which is a package that I'm going to link in the description, which allows us from an URL get all the comments of a YouTube video without us having to build our own scraping logic. The next step is then to load the .env file so we can access the API key. Now we're going to create our configure Gemini function, which is a function that we use to call the Gemini API in a simple way by calling the model that we have installed beforehand. For this, we first use the .env and call from the .env file, where we add this Gemini API key and set it as this variable. We can use it in the rest of the application. We then check if the API key was loaded, and if it doesn't load, then we return error that we didn't find the key, or maybe the key was wrong. So we can get this as a check. We then configure GenAI. So this is this part that we import as the package with our API key, so we can call Gemini directly. And then we return this function as desetted. And then we return this function configured with our API key and with the model, in this case, Gemini 2.0 Flash. Next thing, we're going to initialize our Flask app. For this, we just call app equals Flask, and then we set an app secret, which we can also store in the .env file. But if we haven't set that, then we randomly generate it right here. And then we also set our session, because we want to have a session in our Flask application so that we can have multiple chat sessions at once, meaning that we can not just ask questions about one video, but then reload one for a new video, and it doesn't like convolve in itself. We then create a function with which we can download the comments from the URL. For this, we set the base function, and then we set a try function. Inside this try function, we first set our downloader, where we call the YouTube Comment Downloader, which is the package that we installed here. We then make our comments generator, where we call our downloader. We get the comments from URL subfunction, and then we set the URL in there. We then make two variables, one of comments, which is an array where we store all the comments that we get from our generator, and a count, so we can see how many comments we actually have gotten. And then inside this comments array, we add all the comments that our generator creates, and then we always get +1. So for every comment that's added, we increase the count by 1, and then we return this comments object, or if we don't find anything, we return nothing. And then we return this array at the end of our function. Next, we're making an extract comments text function, which is just a little helper function we use. So from our array of comments that's created from the function that we called, just gets the comments text and not just all the other metadata, because this function doesn't just recall the text, but also, for example, who made the comment, when was the comment made, and all this data. But we don't need this for application, so we just return the text and add that to our comments object. Next thing, we're going to make the Ask Gemini function, which is our main call to the AI, where we first set the context. So this is the entire text form of all the comments that we have gotten. Then we create the base prompt, which is an F string, meaning it's a text string in which we can add variables, in our case, the context, so all the comments that we have gotten, and the question of the user that he will put in the front end, and also the main text prompt for the system. So in this case, based only on above comments, please answer the following questions. If we want to change the way the application talks to us or the information provides, we can change it here. So if you want to say like always provide examples of the comments, you can add that here in the best way, or like say be short and precise, or write formally, or do it in a different language. Then we add a try function to check if the prompt that we put in works with the generate content function that we have created, and if not, we return error. Otherwise, we return the answer as a text. Next thing, we're going to create our base route. This is basically how Flask renders the HTML templates that we have as a path in our domain. So if you have the domain in your browser, and then / would be just like the base domain without any other path, and this shows the index. And in this index, we have the base of our application where we're going to put in the URL, and after the URL is done, it will then send back an information to our application, which sends us then to the chat function. Now we create the /process URL route, which is a post function. So we put data in there, which is basically in our front end. We put in the URL with the YouTube format. We then get the contents out of it and return that back to the front end after it's done. But at first, we have to get the URL from our front end. So we just like send a form where the request is a YouTube URL, and then we store that as the URL. Next things, we generate a comments. For this, we call our download comments function with the URL that we have gotten from our front end and return the comments, or if there was an error, we return an error. Next thing, we do the error handling. So if the comments function didn't work because the video doesn't exist or there are no comments, then we return error, so the user knows that there was something. Next thing, we create our session ID, which we're going to need so that we can have multiple chat sessions at once, which are then handled by our systems. So we don't just put in one URL and then we can only ask a question about one URL without having to restart the whole application, but having different chat sessions for different URLs. Then we create a temp file, which is basically the database that we have in this application. In a real application, you would use like a full-on database to store the comments, but in our case, we just create a temp file with the number of the session ID, and we store all the comments in there so we can reference that later. Then we open that temp file and store all the comments that we have gotten from the URL inside of it. Next thing, we take our session object, and in that we store the temp file, the URL, and the length of the comments so we can use that on later on. And if that has worked, then we turn back to the front end, the success had worked, and the redirect URL for chat. So that if we're in the index and we have gotten all the data back from it, it sends us to the chat part of the application. Now we're building the chat part of it, which is also a route, where we first check if the comments file that was created exists, and if it doesn't exist, we are redirected back to the index, so like the main of the application where we can add a new URL. Then we store the video URL from the sessions object that we created, and also a comment count from also the sessions object that we have created. Then we return that template of chat.html with the video URL and the comment count. Next thing, we're going to create the ask routing, which is basically the actual inside of the chat part. So a session was provided with the comments, and then the user asks the questions about these comments, and then we can actually have the whole chat interface. For this, we first check if the comments file was created. If not, we send an error. Then we create a questions object, which is again a form like we have made in the index for the URL, but in this part for the question that the user types into the chat interface. So we can use that to prompt the AI. Then we load the comments file from the sessions object we have created beforehand. We will then try to open that file to load all the comments out of it. If there was an error with that, we also return it so the user knows if something is broken. Then we call back our extract comments function that we've made it beforehand. So from this object that has not just the text in it, but also who made it, we only get the text part out of it and create one long text of all the comments so we can put it as the context of the AI call. Then we try to configure Gemini, where we try to call the model, see if everything works, and if our API key, for example, was wrong, we would get an error. If that had worked, then we call our Ask Gemini function, where we add the comments text as the context and then as the question. And if this has worked successfully and we get an answer back from Gemini, we then return the answer. If it didn't work, then we get an error. And if this error was created, we return success false to our front end. And if it was correct, then we return true and also the answer so it can be displayed in the front end. We then also create a /clear route, which allows us to delete the comments file and create a new session so we can ask the question about a different URL of a video. And then we start the main function, which basically just makes the Flask server run in the background the whole time and runs it locally under this address in your browser. You can then go on save this file and continue on building the HTML parts so it can be displayed in the browser. For this, we open back our terminal window and create a new folder in which the templates are stored so Flask knows where they are. Go into this folder and first create our index.html file. Then we also create our chat.html file. Now inside our index.html, we create our base HTML part, we name the page, and we add some styling to it. We then create a body part in which we first add the name of the page, and then we create a form in which we then will be storing the URL so the user can put in the URL. And as we've seen beforehand in the Flask app, there is the form where we take out the URL so we can process that in the /process URL. For this, we create this input with a placeholder so the user. We then add a button to be able to get this input field and submit it back to our Flask backend. We then also add a spinner, which will be activated once the user submits it and the comments are loading in the backend, and we're waiting for the response of our backend so the user knows something is happening without exiting out of the app. We then add the JavaScript part. This is relevant for us, so if someone actually clicks the button, then something is happening. In our case, we want to that someone presses the button. We take the data, first load our form data, and then make a simple post request for when someone submits it. We then send the data from the form back to the process URL, and then we await a response. And if it was successful, we then redirect to the chat part of the application, and if it wasn't, then we display an error. And if the whole thing was done, we then close off the application. If an error was shown, we show an error, and we also stop the spinner. We then go and save this file and go on to the chat.html part. Then inside of chat.html, we again set our base HTML part, we name the page comment chat, and we add our base styling to it. We then add our base body, which is a container in which we show the chat, and we display the comments and the video URL on top so the user knows what video they are trying to talk to and the comments that were found. Then inside of there, we add a container of the chat container, which are basically divs that are being added every single time a message came from the app. This is now the first app that comes from the chat. So it starts basically like, hi, I analyzed X amount of comments for the video that you have provided. So this will be the first message that's going to be appeared. And all the other messages come, we just like add underneath that with the JavaScript code. Then on the bottom of the page, we add the form of the actual chat interface. So where we can type our message, and then also a button to submit that back to the /chat backend of the application. We then add the JavaScript part, which in our case just works so that we can submit the chat that comes inside the input field and can be sent back to the backend. For this, we add our fetch function where we then take the data that we put into the input field of the chat and send it back to /ask so it can then be processed and an answer can be created by the AI. We then also add a catch function, so if the backend created any kind of error because maybe the file wasn't there or the message we sent wasn't able to be sent through Gemini, we then set the error and then we also re-enable the send button so a new message can be sent. So we can't just like spam it until the message is not processed yet fully. We then create the function for the clear that we created, which basically if we click it, it reloads the page sends us back to the main page, so the index.html, and also deletes the file on the backend for the comments of that session. And then we also add the add message button, which basically creates this new div that's going to be the messages that have been added underneath our chat. And then we can save this file and we're done with the code part of the application. We then go back in our terminal and go back into the main folder of our application where the Flask app sits. We then, with Python, call the Flask app so that it starts up the server and runs it. So now we're here inside of the application again, and you can see we are at the index. Then we can add the link to a YouTube video. We can press the button load the comments. This sends us back to /process.ul. The comments are being loaded. They're being put into the file. And then if this is done, we're going to be redirected to /chat. And then we can ask a question. For example, what do people like about this video? Be short. And then we can submit that. It's being processed. And then we get this response back from the AI. And if we then press this button for a new video, we're going to delete the temporary file and we're going to be sent back to the index. And that's the whole application. And I hope you liked this and I hope it was helpful. And if you have any other questions, just put in the comments and I'll see you in the next one.